My name is Mary Kahle, and I'm a graduate student in public history at Texas State University. The title of my 2020 Texas Oral History Association project is Protecting a Jewel, the Save Our Springs movement of late 20th century Austin. My project focuses on the founding and early development of the Save Our Springs, or SOS movement, a citizen-driven campaign of the late 1980s and early 1990s to protect Barton Springs, a spring-fed swimming pool in the heart of Austin. I hope to capture the key players' voices to preserve the movement's history and contribute to the ongoing debates about water quality. My interviews cover a wide range of participants, from activists and politicians to real estate developers and media figures. Texas State University Archives will be the repository for the recordings, transcriptions, and other associated documentation. The findings so far reveal the importance of power, personality, and local culture converging on a cause, with strong overlap among politics, business, activism, and social life. An interesting phenomenon of the movement is that of couples, including 5 married couples who had very or relatively high-profile roles. The issues around water quality are still taking place, whether because of drought, development, or pipeline construction. Some of the ongoing questions are, to what extent does Austin still have an environmental movement? What has been the role of communities of color in the Austin environmental story? What are the greatest takeaways from the SOS movement? In the late 1980s, development pressure in Austin threatened water quality in Barton Springs and nearby creeks and aquifers, leading citizens and activists to coalesce around stricter water protection standards. The story had 3 high-profile events. The first was this. On June 7, 1990, hundreds gathered to speak at an Austin City Council meeting, the legendary all-night hearing, to oppose a mixed-use 4,000-acre Barton Creek Planned Unit Development, or PUD, proposed by developer and businessman Jim Bob Moffitt and his company Freeport-McMoran. In the aftermath of the meeting, the citizens formed a movement to strengthen a mid-1980s ordinance under the acronym SOS, or Save Our Springs. The second event was this. In the groundswell of the ensuing support after the all-night hearing, citizens gathered 30,000 signatures to bring a stricter water quality ordinance up for a vote. However, City Council refused to schedule a May election to evaluate the petition drive, causing a delay under which developers filed plans that were grandfathered under older rules. The third event was when the ordinance came before voters in August 1992, where it received overwhelming support, along with support for bonds to acquire habitat for endangered species. This led to the creation of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve in 1996 to protect habitat for 2 migratory songbirds, the golden-cheeked warbler and black-cap vireo, and 6 cave invertebrates. The ensuing battles went to the Texas legislature and back and forth between the city of Austin and the courts. Many of the participants are still here, most of them still very active in Austin affairs. This project is an attempt to capture that wide range of voices, whether conservationists, developers, politicians, or entertainers, to preserve this important history for researchers and ordinary citizens. In my interview efforts, I've reached out to environmental activists, real estate developers, politicians, campaign organizers, scientists, media figures, and entertainers. The most public face of the SOS movement was Bridget Shea. Bridget was a newcomer to town in the late 1980s, a former NPR journalist in Philadelphia and Minnesota. She was one of the co-founders of the SOS Coalition and later served as a city council member. Bridget currently serves as a Travis County Commissioner. Here are her thoughts upon going to the all-night hearing on June 7th, 1990.
I'd worked as a reporter for about a dozen years before I came down here, and I'd covered a lot of really big events. And I was just blown away. There were so many thousands and thousands of people, and there were, businessmen with briefcases and young children and African Americans and Hispanics and people of all age range and income level and background. And I was really taken by how broad a popular uprising this appeared to be. And I literally, at that moment, decided to make Austin my home.
Another environmental activist I spoke with was Bill Bunch, an environmental attorney, a co-founder of the SOS Coalition, and currently the executive director of the Save Our Springs Alliance. Save Our Springs Alliance is a nonprofit that emerged in the years following the SOS movement. Bill Bunch led in the drafting of a position paper that brought the various environmental coalitions together around a common consensus document that would say, this is what we want. That became the main precursor to the SOS ordinance. Other environmental activists I spoke with include longtime Austinites, Shudi Fath and Mary Arnold. Austin is interesting in that it has a cadre of longtime female activists that are legendary within the city. Here's what Shudi said when I asked her thoughts about the all-night hearing.
Somebody, one of our enemies, who was Mayor, Lee Cook?
I think so.
Yeah. Somebody went in and complained because Shudi Fath was out selling something on the city sidewalk, and they wanted it stopped and wanted me thrown out or something. And I think Lee Cook told him it wasn't going to happen.
Mary Arnold says of the all-night hearing, I got in line, I guess. And I think I got to speak after former Mayor Frank Cooksey spoke. And about all I had to say was, look, they're presenting you with this. They want you to approve this mud application and you haven't even read. Don't do it. Mary also remembers of the effort to write a consensus document. I can remember very clearly one of the meetings we had to draft the ordinance itself. And Bill Bunch was there writing things down and trying to put it together. But you had a whole room full of knowledgeable people, some with scientific and engineering knowledge, trying to decide what's the percentage of impervious cover that's going to protect the watershed, etc. There was give and take. Other environmentalists I spoke with include Helen Ballou, a longtime conservationist and a founding member of the SOS Coalition. Helen also was a co-founder of Austin Business Leaders for the Environment, and her efforts to reach the business community during the SOS movement were instrumental in bringing many in the business community on board with the movement. Helen, in her interviews, emphasizes the role of what she calls little d democracy. She's been quoted in other publications saying this, and she mentioned it in our interview as well, where she talks about the power of the everyday citizen to create change. I also spoke with Jackie Goodman, longtime Austinite and activist for many causes, who served on Austin City Council. She said, everybody wanted to move by a creek, totally ignoring the fact that a lot of development along a creek is not going to be good for you if you don't try to protect what you have. John Umphris, a conservationist, environmentalist, also served as a data person for the SOS movement. And he has a fun recollection about some of the early fundraising efforts.
Kind of kicked off an effort, a grassroots fundraising effort, where we would take these old, the big plastic pickle jars, gallon pickle jars, and volunteers would take them around to the nightclubs and the bars, and where you had live music. And and at a break in the music, they would essentially make an announcement and pass that pickle jar around.
I also spoke with Bo Armstrong, a real estate developer and former assistant to businessman Jim Bob Moffitt, whose plans for a planned unit development created so much outcry at the all-night hearing. Here's what Bo had to say about Jim Bob.
But here's Jim Bob, who had deep resources, had a love for Austin. He played football here for Daryl Royal. He was a exemplary student. Really loved Austin, and he came in and he started to invest here when nobody was investing. And so naturally, anyone would think, well, if I'm investing in a depressed market, people would probably think that's a good idea. I'm going to put people back to work. I'm going to start to improve property values. And it just didn't work out that way. So I don't think he anticipated the backlash, if you will, at all. I mean, I know he didn't.
So Bo Armstrong is referring to the steep downturn in Austin in the 1980s, which came up frequently in my interviews. And that led to some of the tension you see where, because of real estate downturns, some of the land was bought up for future development at the same time that there was an increasing environmental awareness. And so it was that how do we bring Austin into the future in the wake of this deep recession in the 1980s while still protecting the environment? Key to the SOS movement were political organizers. Two I've spoken with so far include Marquise Naga and David Butts. Both of them are longtime political managers here in Austin and have worked on a number of different causes. Here's what Mark had to say about his role in the SOS movement.
Was looked for a way to get political effort embedded in cultural city and real sort of last. And this was like nothing else. It's never been, and I think that's why it's so extraordinary.
Both Mark and David Butts recognized early on the groundswell of support for the SOS movement. And they seized upon that opportunity and that momentum to bring some organization to the disparate voices of the environmental community in Austin. Here's what David Butts had to say after he listened to the all-night hearing on the radio.
The following day, after the great marathon council session that had occurred, I had not go. I knew that it was happening, but I turned on my radio and listened to John Kahle talking about it. And after listening to it for a while and realizing that over 1,000 people had shown up there and it had gone on all night with tremendous resistance to what was being proposed as far as the intensity of development, I called my friend Marquise Naga and said, a political movement is being born.
Another person who recognized the importance of what was taking place in Austin at the time was Daryl Slusher, who wrote for the Austin Chronicle and continues as a journalist today. Daryl also subsequently served on Austin City Council and in various other capacities with the city of Austin. And he said, I started looking at that packet of information about the Freeport-McMoran PUG, that's what he was referring to. And I was like, man, this is some serious stuff. And Austin was just about to come out of a bust. And it looked like there was another boom. This is a big story here. I'm going to run with this. Daryl is credited by many with bringing the information and news about the environmental movement to the public at large. So the rest of the story, or where do I go from here? I plan to continue conducting some of the easy to obtain interviews, but also to keep reaching out for those that are more difficult. The outreach to the development community is more difficult than outreach to the environmental community, but I'm very focused on trying to obtain those voices if and where I can. I also plan to explore some of the themes and threads that were identified in the interview process. One of those is the involvement of communities of color in the environmental movement in Austin, where it was then and where it stands today. I will continue doing the follow-up work for my interviews, including the word lists, i.e. the lists of terms, and the transcriptions, whether I do them myself or find an alternate way to do that. I will continue to identify avenues for promoting the SOS movement story, whether in academia or other publications, so that citizens and researchers can continue to learn from its powerful story about how citizens can fight for the things they believe in. Thank you very much.